Remember that bit where some guy on some other YouTube channel, the name escapes me at the moment, asks people to describe Star Wars characters without referring to their appearance or their job? What if we did that for Star Trek characters? I bet even most casual viewers could come up with something to say about Captain Kirk, or Spock, or Picard, or Data, but it wouldn't be that easy for every Trek character. And I'm not even talking about one-offs who showed up in a single episode and were never heard from again. I mean established recurring characters, in many cases even names in the opening credits series regulars. Every iteration of Star Trek has characters like that, characters that seem like they're important to the world in which the series takes place, but who even some of us diehard fans would struggle to describe because we just never get to know them very well. So anyway, I'm making this video all about those characters. This'll be fun. Since, like I said, every version of Star Trek has these potentially interesting but overlooked or underdeveloped characters, I think this calls for a systematic approach. So let's go through each Star Trek series and talk about the characters with the most wasted potential, then circle back and see if we can't figure out who got screwed the hardest. What do you say? Does that strike you as reasonable? Was it folksy enough? Anyway, let's begin where Star Trek began, with the original series. Unlike the later spin-offs in the franchise, which made more extensive uses of their ensembles, nearly every episode of the original Star Trek is centered on either the first lead, Captain Kirk, or the second lead, Spock. On the rare occasion when an episode didn't revolve around one of them, it almost always focused on Dr. McCoy. Remaining bits of leftover characterization were passed to Scotty, and whatever he didn't use just kind of fell on the floor for the rest of the supporting cast to fight over. Here you go, Sulu. Here's a chance to show us all how ripped you are in one episode, and a few randomly selected hobbies. Check off, here's a speech impediment that should prove very memorable, and a running joke about how everything comes from Russia. And Uhura, do you want to sing, maybe? Honestly, when it comes to picking the character with the most wasted potential in classic Trek, I could throw a dart at a cast photo. No one outside of the big three of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy was very well served in the series. They all got little moments to shine here and there. That's about it. But if I had to choose without resorting to the dartboard method, I think I'd have to go with Uhura. Other than the handful of opportunities she got to show off her awesome singing voice, that time she got to pull a knife on Mirror Universe Sulu, and, of course, the celebrated kiss she shares with Kirk in Plato's Stepchildren, her most memorable moments are probably all those times she tells Kirk that she's frightened. I know she only says that once or twice, but it sticks in my head, so it seems like she's saying it all the time. What she's actually doing most of the time is turning around from her console to inform Kirk that someone's on the phone. But it's more than how the show ignores or sidelines her. It's also the fact that Uhura is forced to endure what ought to be traumatic, life-altering experiences which could be the basis for compelling character development, but instead are quickly shrugged off as she's shoved once again into the background. Like, remember in The Changeling, when Nomad wipes Uhura's memory, and she never gets it back? Kirk even tells Nomad, hey, fix her brain, dude, but Nomad is like, that's a no-can-do, creator. So McCoy and Nurse Chapel re-educate Uhura using the ship's computer. We see her learning to read again like a child. By the next episode, she's back to normal, like it never happened. Did her memory somehow return despite what Nomad said? Is she just starting over from zero? It's never definitely established. And the point I want to stress is, it doesn't matter. Because ultimately, Uhura isn't treated as though she matters. And that's a shame, because Nichelle Nichols does an excellent job with what little she's given to do, and it would have been nice to see her get the chance to do more. Plus, Uhura was the only woman and the only black person in the show's main cast. That being the case, her being treated like scenery most of the time seems even more regrettable. Before I move on, I just realized I did say I was going to begin where Star Trek began, didn't I? And Star Trek didn't begin with what we know as the original series. It began with the initially unaired pilot, The Cage. And I suppose, with the exception of Spock, who survived retooling and made it into the second pilot and ultimately the series, you could say all of the characters from The Cage had wasted potential. But if I were to rank that cast according to who represented the biggest missed opportunity, there's no doubt in my mind who would be number one. Just think. Were it not for some sexist TV executives, the Starship Enterprise would have had a woman second in command in 1965. Or 2254, I guess, if we're talking in universe dates. I mean, technically, the Enterprise did have a woman second in command in 2254 because The Cage is considered canon. It's just that we didn't get to see very much of it. Although number one does show up in season 2 of Discovery, and a couple of short treks, and who knows if that Captain Pike spinoff actually happens. Never mind, I'm getting sidetracked. You know what I mean. Just one last classic Trek related thing. Between the original series and the Next Generation, the classic Trek cast made some movies. Did you know about this? Anyway, it's mostly the same characters as in the show, but there are a few newcomers thrown into the mix as well. If you're curious which of the major characters introduced in the TOS film series I'd pick as having the most wasted potential, that would be David Marcus. He's Captain Kirk's son, for God's sake, and he gets unceremoniously killed off in his second appearance? Don't misunderstand, I think what they did with David was good, especially in Star Trek II. The way his relationship with Kirk develops in that film is lovely. I just think they could have done a lot more with him, shown us more sides of his character, and just as importantly, explored facets of Kirk we never got to see. Honorable mention for the movies goes to Sybok. Oh hey, by the way, Spock has a half-brother, and he's a renegade Vulcan religious fanatic. Oh, and he's dead, gotta go, bye! Now on to TNG. Choosing the character with the most wasted potential for this show is a lot more difficult than I thought it would be, even if I limit myself only to regulars and important recurring characters. One obvious candidate is Tasha Yar, who was killed off in the first season before she had a chance to grow beyond a promising type, but I already did a whole video about her, and there are plenty of other good contenders. I seriously considered Dr. Pulaski, another one-season wonder. With Dr. Crusher gone for season 2, the producers went for a Dr. McCoy sort of thing with Pulaski, and that could have been really interesting had it been allowed to develop over the years, but it was not to be. Dr. Crusher returned in season 3, and even though I think Pulaski catches a lot of undeserved flack from fans for the simple fact that she wasn't Beverly, I like Beverly, and I'm not sad she came back to the show, even though it meant Pulaski had to be beamed into space. You don't know that's not what happened to her. Once I gave it some consideration, the TNG character with the most wasted potential was glaringly apparent. She was in front of me the whole time, sitting right next to the captain. Yeah. Counselor Troi. She was the most poorly written character of all the series regulars, but she didn't have to be. A mental health professional holding such an important position on a starship that she gets a seat on the bridge right next to the commanding officer. I bet there's a ton of untapped story potential there, but the writers of TNG just never seemed interested in exploring it. Instead, Deanna was stuck being the pretty one in the low-cut costume who was supposedly really smart but almost never actually said or did anything intelligent or useful. She had the opposite of Uhura's problem. The writers paid attention to her character, it's just that most of what they wrote for her was terrible. Honorable mention for TNG goes to Ensign Ro, a fascinating recurring character with a compelling backstory who brought some very welcome interpersonal conflict into the ensemble and interacted with the other members of the cast in ways that always made things interesting, but who sadly appeared in only 8 episodes. Can you imagine what they would have done with a character like her on Deep Space Nine? Right. We don't have to imagine, do we? Speaking of Deep Space Nine, I thought this would be the toughest show to pick a most wasted character from, because most of the regulars and major recurring characters were handled very well. Hell, instead of wasting potential, the writers of DS9 would conjure unforgettable characters out of ones who initially seemed to have no potential to be anything other than glorified extras or one-time guest stars. Right, Damar? But then I thought about it, and it's obviously Ezri Dax. It's not for lack of effort on the writer's part. They devoted a lot of screen time to Ezri and succeeded in developing her into a likable, interesting character during the show's 7th season. Unfortunately, DS9's 7th season was its last, and we never got to see where Ezri might have gone beyond that. Presumably, if they'd had more than one season to work with, the writers would have come up with stories for her a little less obvious than hooking up with Jadzia's ex and hooking up with the dude who creeped on Jadzia for a few years, or at least been able to give both of those storylines a bit more room to breathe instead of having to sprint through them. When you consider the hole Ezri started out in, stepping into an established cast following the departure of Jadzia Dax, one of the show's best and most popular characters, it's all the more impressive what the writers and Nicole DeBoer, who played Ezri, were able to accomplish in a single season. And yeah, there were times when it felt strangely like the Ezri show, but I think that's just a reflection of the determination of everyone involved to do something with this character, even if they had just one season to do it. If only there were more time, Ezri. Honorable mention, maybe Zial. Gul Dukat's half-Bajaran daughter, love interest for Garrick, friend/surrogate child to Kira, tension with Damar. Sounds great on paper, but in terms of execution, not so much. She was one of the few characters on DS9 who I felt like I was supposed to care about, but just didn't. Moving on to Voyager. Can I just say everybody? Okay, almost everybody. I said almost. In all seriousness, I'm a dipshit talking about Star Trek while wearing the cap of a fictional baseball team. In all seriousness, it's Harry Kim. He's the character on Voyager with the most wasted potential, and with good reason, because while almost every character on Voyager is a wasted opportunity, starting with the very first episode, Harry has something most of the other characters lack: a built-in arc. Harry Kim is the fresh-faced ensign. He's just graduated from Starfleet Academy. Voyager is his first assignment. And what happens? The ship gets pulled across the galaxy and stranded 70,000 light years from home. The promising young officer with the bright future who has that future yanked away from him a few hours into his first posting. The idealist who finds himself in a situation where he is forced to choose between those ideals and his own survival. There was such a rich vein of story and character to explore with Harry, and it was all there naturally as a result of who he was and the situation he was placed in by the show. And that's the best kind of characterization. Establish who a character is, put them in a difficult situation, force them to adapt. That's what us highfalutin writer types refer to as character development. Harry was also one of the only characters in the series to exhibit a significant sense of being homesick, or to display any indication that he gave a shit at all about being stranded on the other side of the galaxy 70 years at high warp from the Federation. There were so many places for Harry to go in terms of character development, so many mile markers in his life he hadn't reached yet, because he starts out earlier in his life's journey than any other character on the show. Except one, but hold that thought. And so much stuff happens to Harry during the show. Really heavy, dramatic stuff. Stuff like almost dying after being infected by species 8472, or learning that a future version of himself had rescued Voyager from a disaster that had killed nearly the entire crew the first time, or dying and being replaced by a duplicate. That happens in the second season. It's never mentioned again! Instead of using any of that to propel change and character growth, we got Harry randomly switching from the clarinet to the sax. Riveting. The poor bastard doesn't even get promoted. 7 years on the ship. He starts out as an ensign, he finishes as an ensign. And I know some fans tried to defend that by saying Janeway had a limited crew and couldn't promote people like she could were she still in Federation space because she needed everyone where they were. But I call bullshit on that because Harry's job on the ship throughout the run of the series was operations officer. And you don't need to be an ensign to work ops. Data was the ops officer aboard the Enterprise, and he was a lieutenant commander. There's no reason Harry couldn't have been bumped up to lieutenant by the end of the show. Or hell, even Lieutenant JG. Does he not deserve a hollow pip by the last year? You're telling me after 7 years in the Delta Quadrant, the valedictorian and recipient of interstellar honors of the Starfleet Academy class of 2370 and goddamn ops officer hasn't earned the hollow pip? Despite my histrionics, the rank isn't really the problem. The problem is Harry is set up at the start of the series as a character with an arc ahead of him. The show instills certain expectations in us regarding his character. Now, a good show that ran for, say, 7 years and 172 episodes would spend that time finding creative ways of either fulfilling or defying those expectations. The end result being, at the end of that run, a character who has been affected by his experiences, who has matured, who has adapted, who has been wounded and who has healed, who is different at the end of his journey than he was when he started. Can you imagine if a Star Trek show actually did that with a character of a type broadly similar to Harry's? Wouldn't that be awesome? Wouldn't it? And the writers and producers of Star Trek Voyager could have done that with Harry, and with the rest of the cast, but let's focus. It doesn't matter what the premise of the show was. It doesn't matter that Janeway had a limited crew and therefore a good reason for keeping Harry at ensign the whole time. Hey, it's fiction. It's all made up. There is no Captain Janeway. There is no USS Voyager. Hell, if they wanted to keep Harry at the same rank, make that part of the story. Show him getting pissed about it, or frustrated, or depressed, or something. Have it become a source of tension between himself and Janeway. Do something with it. Do something. The creators had a solid basis for a character with a natural arc laid out ahead of him and a likable, capable actor to play that character in Garrett Wang, and they could have done anything with Harry they wanted. Instead, they chose to do nothing. And that is such a waste that it even stands out on Star Trek Voyager, the series with by far the most wasted potential in the entire franchise. Honorable mention for Voyager is Kes, who I alluded to earlier, the one major character who is younger than Harry. Kes also has a natural arc due to the nature of her character and her situation in the show, and like Harry, that arc is almost entirely neglected, and then she's written off halfway through the series to make room for 7 of 9. And that worked out fine for the show, but it's a shame they didn't do more with Kes in the 3 seasons they had her. Enterprise! Let's see, who could be the character with the most wasted potential here? There are so many factors to consider. After all, there are numerous elements in the series, which it's Travis. And honestly, there's not much for me to say about Ensign Travis Mayweather and how his potential was squandered during the series, because most of what I just said about Harry Kim applies to him too. Like Harry, Travis is the rookie with his whole career ahead of him, and like Harry, his character ends up going pretty much nowhere. The biggest difference between Harry Kim and Travis Mayweather is that even though it failed to develop Harry, at least Voyager didn't usually ignore him. He was written as an important supporting character and given things to do that were relevant to the story being told in the episode, more often than not anyway. That was not the case for Travis. There are stretches of Enterprise, sometimes for several episodes running, where Travis, a series regular and senior officer aboard the ship, is barely even there. He might get 1 or 2 throwaway lines, if any at all. He's so neglected throughout Enterprise's 4 seasons, he's the only regular character on a Trek series who could legitimately envy the amount of screen time and characterization devoted to Uhura in classic Trek. Honorable mention for Enterprise, gotta go with Hoshi. Not as neglected as Travis, but another character who starts out with a built-in arc, brilliant but young and naive, who just never quite gets out of the first stage. Before we jump ahead to the current crop of Trek shows, let's not forget the Kelvin timeline films, because they are Star Trek too. And I think they're good. Okay? I know like all the hip, edgy Trekkies love to hate on the Kelvin movies, but I, being neither hip nor edgy, like them, and I treat them just like any other series in the franchise. And when I think of which character in the Kelvin series has the most wasted potential, there's only one face that pops into my mind. I'd be pissed too, man. I was super hyped when I heard that Captain Pike would be a character in the 2009 Star Trek film, and that he would be portrayed by Bruce Greenwood, one of my favorite actors ever. Why haven't I done a video about Nowhere Man? I need to get on that. And while I like the '09 Star Trek film, and I think it uses Pike pretty well, I still can't help but think they left a lot on the table when they decided to kill him off early on in the sequel, Star Trek Into Darkness. The Kelvin reboot was an opportunity to show us new versions of familiar characters, and it did that, but it was never quite as interested in taking those familiar characters in new directions as I might have hoped. I get the appeal of revisiting classic stories and restaging them with the new cast and a few twists thrown in, and actually, the IDW comic book series set in the Kelvin timeline did a decent job of doing just that. However, there are so many more creative directions these characters could have been taken, but weren't. They had Pike set up for something interesting in the second movie. He's been promoted to Admiral, he's not in space anymore, but he's still active, and he's an advocate and mentor for Kirk, but he's also Kirk's boss. If this were a cop show, Kirk would be the loose cannon detective who breaks the rules but gets the job done, and Pike would be his by-the-book lieutenant who is constantly pounding his fist on the desk and screaming at Kirk that he's off the case, and god damn, I want that movie! We get a glimpse of that in Into Darkness. The Pike-Kirk stuff makes up some of my favorite scenes in that movie. I just wish there was a lot more of it. Honorable mention for the Kelvin movies goes to Carol Marcus. We know that the prime version of Carol Marcus is a brilliant scientist who eventually hooks up with Kirk, the result of that union being David. In Star Trek Into Darkness, we meet the younger version of Carol, and she stands around in her underwear for a few seconds and helps McCoy disarm a torpedo, and that's about it. She joins the crew at the end of the film, but by the time we get to Star Trek Beyond, she's gone. Whatever. Good to meet you, Carol. Thanks for stopping by. You can get dressed. Star Trek Discovery. One of the problems with this show from the beginning has been how little we've gotten to know the bridge crew of the ship. We learn a lot about Burnham, and Saru, and Tilly, and the captains, Lorca in Season 1 and Pike in Season 2, but there are other people who are always on the bridge, who are in almost every scene that takes place on the bridge, whose names we probably wouldn't even know if Pike hadn't taken role early on in Season 2. Like the communications officer, he's Lieutenant Bryce, by the way, or the tactical officer, that'd be Lieutenant Reese, or Lieutenant Commander Ariam, whose job seemed to be monitoring the spore drive from the bridge. She had a distinctive look, obviously, but it felt like she appeared in a few episodes before I even caught her name. She did eventually get a whole bunch of character development in a single episode, right before she was killed off. I almost went with Ariam for the character with the most wasted potential, but I think the two characters I've narrowed it down to are even more poorly served by the writers of the show than she was. And of course, I'm talking about Lieutenants Kayla Detmer and Joanne Owoshikun, who are typically seen operating the forward con and ops stations. We get a little bit of background on them both, sprinkled throughout the show's 2 seasons. We know Detmer previously served on the USS Shenzhou under Captain Giorgio, where Burnham was the first officer. We know Detmer was injured at some point after the Battle of Binary Stars, but before Burnham came aboard Discovery. We know she was friends with Ariam, and that they bonded over the shared experience of having received cybernetic implants. And we know her best friend was someone named Tazzy. We know Awoshikun was raised in a Luddite collective, so she presumably had limited contact with advanced technology as a child. And we know that her parents practiced no religion. And we know that she was friends with Arium too. And that's it, really, for Awoshikun. And look, it's not necessarily a huge deal that we don't know much about everyone on the bridge. Just because past Star Trek shows have structured the main cast so that the important characters were also mostly bridge officers doesn't mean Discovery has to. And there were bridge officers we saw repeatedly on classic Trek and TNG who were basically glorified extras who got a line once in a while, and maybe we learned their names and maybe we didn't. They weren't that important. And unlike most of the others I've talked about so far, Detmer and Awoshikun are not series regulars. They're recurring characters. But on the other hand, they're also apparently the lead con and ops officers. Awoshikun isn't the person who magically materializes to take over at ops when Data leaves to go on an away mission. She's Data, and we know almost nothing about her. We know almost nothing about Detmer either, and it feels like we should know more about both of them, given their positions in the crew, and given the fact that they are apparently friends with other more prominent characters on the show, particularly Tilly. Now, I don't know if Detmer has more wasted potential than Awoshikun, or if Awoshikun has more wasted potential than Detmer, so I'm gonna call it a tie, because it's my video and I make the rules. And if that bothers you, you're not gonna like this next bit either, because when I thought about who has the most wasted potential on Star Trek Picard, that wound up a tie too. Who else could it possibly be but Laris and Zhaban, the Romulan housekeepers at Picard's estate? They're obviously close confidants of Picard. They have mysterious histories with the Tal Shiar, and they're both pretty good in a fight, so of course, they disappear after episode 3, and we never see them again for the rest of the season. Picard sets off on an adventure involving Borg and a clandestine Romulan plot, and a secret planet of androids, and a possibly malevolent super-evolved artificial intelligence that threatens all organic life, and his badass Romulan buddies stay behind to... what? Pick grapes? Come on! Of course, there's one thing about Discovery and Picard that sets them apart from the other shows, and that is they are both still in production. We can lament the lost storytelling opportunities regarding Uhura or Harry Kim or Travis Mayweather with a certain sense of finality because their shows are long over. But Discovery's third season is due to premiere sometime later this year, and a second season of Picard is being developed as we speak. So it's possible Detmer and Awoshikun and Laris and Zhaban could have some of their untapped potential fulfilled in future episodes. And if not, at least they've got a Star Trek show on their resume. When their series end and they're doing Sci-Fi Channel original movies to pay the bills, that should at least be enough to get their names mentioned in the promos. From the producers of Sharknado, Tim Kang, Courtney Ford, and Star Trek Discovery's Oyen Oladijo star in Clear Lake Snakequake. I'd watch it. Anyway, that's all I really had to say. I feel like I'm forgetting something. Oh yeah, I said I would end by choosing the character with the most wasted potential in the entire Star Trek franchise, didn't I? That's tougher than you might think. I mean, yeah, I just spent the whole video talking about all these characters from every iteration of Star Trek, but how do you pick just one? To begin with, it's totally subjective, so even selecting a fair criteria by which to compare characters from different shows produced across several decades by creative teams that each had their own unique It's Travis. There you have it. That was my look at some of the most underutilized characters in the Star Trek franchise. I'm going to let you know what the subject of the next Regulation Trek Actually video will be in a minute, but first, I want to recognize some of my newest Patreon patrons. Let's do some shout-outs. Laura Ruby T. Arnold, thank you, Laura. Eddie Kaplan, thank you, Eddie. Adam Augusto, thank you, Adam. Billy the Blue fucking Ranger Cranston, thank you, Billy. Phoebo, thank you, Phoebo. Grumpy Old Nord, thank you, Grumpy Old Nord. Scottius, thank you, Scottius. Mel, thank you, Mel. Blade Upton, thank you, Blade. James, thank you, James. Velociraptor, thank you, Velociraptor. Eric Allen, thank you, Eric. Jan Volmer, thank you, Jan. Brian Young, thank you, Brian. Alex Crumwide, thank you, Alex. Doug, thank you, Doug. Mike McManus, thank you, Mike. Anonymous, thank you, Anonymous. Z910, thank you, Z910. Ulrich Feint, thank you, Ulrich. Pizza Pants, thank you, Pizza Pants. Leanne Rafferty, thank you, Leanne. Albeit, thank you, Al. Cassandra Brockett, thank you, Cassandra. Isaiah Taylor, thank you, Isaiah. Chris Dunnigan, thank you, Chris. Tashby, thank you, Tashby. And Stuart, thank you, Stuart. That is one of the largest groups of new patrons I have ever shouted out in a Trek Actually video, and I am so grateful to all of you who have joined my Patreon campaign recently, and to all of you who are patrons no matter how long you have been. It's tough times for many of us. I know not everyone can afford to support people on Patreon, and many of those who can afford it might find that money is better spent elsewhere. So to all of my new patrons and my long-standing patrons, please know from the bottom of my heart how much I appreciate you. If you're not a patron and you'd like to support my work, you can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives. Pledges of any amount are very welcome, but $5 a month or more earns you a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. I could not do this without my patrons, so thanks to all of you. Also, a quick reminder that if you enjoy my YouTube work, especially the Star Trek stuff, you might be interested to know, if you don't already, that I co-host a Star Trek-themed comedy podcast called The Ensign's Log, alongside Jason Harding, also known as the funny one who does all the work. On The Ensign's Log, Jason and I play low-ranking officers serving aboard a certain legendary Federation ship as it carries out a certain historic 5-year mission. We're 3 episodes into our 3rd season, having a great time. If you'd like to check out the show, the links are in the description of this video. You can listen on the website, on SoundCloud, or subscribe via RSS and listen using your favorite podcast app. Check out The Ensign's Log. Now then, the poll to decide June's Trek Actually topic will be up today on the Patreon page, patreon.com/Steve Shives. So if you're a patron or thinking of becoming a patron, watch for the post containing the link to the poll, and don't forget to vote to help choose June's topic. As for next month's Trek Actually video, it will examine a question that has been on the minds of a lot of Trekkies recently, given certain events depicted in the 1st season of Star Trek Picard. One of the most controversial elements of the Picard series was its portrayal of Starfleet as a less than heroic organization, an organization that had abandoned or at least seriously compromised some of its defining principles. But is that really a new idea? Have we been given reasons to doubt Starfleet's purity and benevolence by previous Star Trek shows as well? We'll look at the issue in next month's Regulation Trek Actually video, which will explore the question, is Starfleet actually the bad guy? Hope you enjoyed this episode. See you soon. Take care, everybody.